Hello, everyone. Welcome to the third day of the program for GapSummit. We opened the program today with a keynote by Dr. Robert McCarroll. Dr. McCarroll serves as a member of the Research and Development Leadership Team as Head of Open Innovation and Strategic Partnerships for the Crop Science Division of Bayer. Prior to joining Bayer, Dr. McCarroll led science, strategy, and investments at Monsanto.
Good morning. I'm really pleased to be here. And I also want to say I've been pleased that you invited the speakers to attend all the parts of the conference. And I've been able to come to the last couple of days a significant part. And I've really enjoyed hearing the perspectives of the other speakers in quite different industries than my own. And kind of seeing that some of the challenges are quite similar in pharma and ag. How do you make sure you get a return on your R&D investment, and the challenges to doing so, and identifying the right problems to work on, challenges involved in building teams that do good science, because that's all essential. What I want to talk about today is a complete shift of topic into the agriculture space. And I want to start, I think I was asked to address that question. And to tell you the truth, my answer is I don't know. But I want to start off with what's the challenge? Because right now, the true thing is that there is enough food production in the world to ensure nutrition for everyone in the world. And the fact that in some places and some people don't have access to good nutrition, this is not fundamentally a problem of production. It's a problem of governments, politics, and economics, okay? And the question, though, is will that always be the case unless we change some things? And I think the answer is it's not likely to always be the case that production will be adequate unless we can learn how to get more out of every acre and do it more sustainably than we do today. And so what are those challenges that might have that impact? And I think that there's just a few chief ones here. One is global population continues to rise. It's rising very rapidly. It's likely to be 10 billion people by 2050. More people need more food. Changing patterns of diet, okay? So it might be true that in the West, the per capita consumption of meat is declining. In the emerging nations, those with more economies where people now have more disposable income than they've ever had before, one of the first things they do when you have more disposable income is change your diet to include more meat as protein source and calorie source. Meat is a notoriously inefficient user of the primary agricultural product. And so if meat consumption continues to rise, and it's likely to, and the number of people in the world continues to rise, that puts more strain on the production capability. Biofuel will become an increasing consumer of agricultural output. And so food will be in competition with fuel. And, you know, this actually gets a little bit to my point about enough food being produced. 1/3 of food is wasted post-harvest, right? That can only be true in a world where you're producing more than is actually needed. And this is a luxury, particularly in the West, that we can put up with this. That's probably a thing that's going to need to change in the future as well. The amount of farmland that's available per person to produce food is declining, partly because the number of people are going up, but partly because the amount of arable land is going down as it gets developed for other purposes. And it'll go down even more as climate change becomes more severe. And it's here already, but significant fractions of land that are currently under cultivation may become uncultivatable in the not too distant future due to the effects of climate change. Dry places are going to get drier, hot places are going to get hotter, wet places are going to get wetter, and all of it's going to be more unpredictable and harder to manage. So there's one more challenge I want to mention that's not on this slide, and that's fertility. So an awful lot of crop production today depends very much on the addition of nitrogen fertilizer. You could never have the output that we have today in the non-leguminous crops without the addition of nitrogen. This is one of the, in my mind, this is one of the chief elements of modern agriculture that's unsustainable. Why is it unsustainable? Production of nitrogen fertilizer consumes enormous amounts of electrical energy, right? Most of that is derived from fossil fuels. So there's maybe an opportunity to get it from other energy sources, okay, but that's still not the problem, the only problem. Most of the nitrogen fertilizer that's applied doesn't actually end up benefiting the plants. Typically, growers apply excess, and it leaches off from the soil, and it runs into the rivers, and in the US at least, it all goes down to the Gulf of Mexico and creates dead zones, okay? So there's a sustainability challenge, not just production challenge, but can we keep doing this and maintain a decent environment that we can all continue to live in? And so some things are gonna have to change. It's a little bit about climate change. I think it just repeats what I said. It's real and it's here now already. 7 years of drought in Australia, the worst on record. Saw record wet spring in the Midwest, flooding. We're probably planted only 60% of the corn and soy that we usually plant because the wet has kept growers from doing planting. That might be a challenge to the food supply this year. Okay, so a lot of big challenges. To reference the movie The Martian, if you've seen it, in the face of overwhelming odds, scientists turn to science. And that's what Bayer is aimed at doing here. And so this is a little bit about Bayer. Maybe when you think of Bayer, you don't think of agriculture. Probably you think of aspirin, right? Because that's the Bayer aspirin is what everyone's known for. And in fact, I learned here this week that even some people here didn't know that Bayer does crop science. So this is my chance to tell you about that. And it's one of the leading developers of agriculture technology, especially since the acquisition of Monsanto, which just happened last year. With that, we have in the crop sciences R&D division over 7,000 scientists working on innovation for ag technology and an R&D budget approaching $2.5 billion a year. $2.5 billion is a pretty good chunk of change to invest in new technology. I think it dwarfs most of the pharma R&D budgets you saw yesterday. And it's our goal to try to turn that into meaningful change for growers and for the world. To do that, we're bringing together multiple kinds of technologies, seeds, traits, chemistries, and other forms of crop protection increasingly, and trying to tie it all together with digital approaches to optimizing agriculture. Okay, and our aim is to serve all kinds of growers all over the world. It's truly a global company. We serve large-scale industrial farmers, everything from the 30,000 hectare soybean farm in Brazil to the 2-hectare cotton farm in India. Okay, so it's kind of a big ambition to serve everybody. We can't do all the innovations ourselves. We know this. And it's a true thing that no matter how much our R&D budget is, there's going to be more innovation and good ideas outside the walls of our company than inside the walls. And that's why I have the job that I have, which is lead open innovation. And my team's responsibility is to look for interesting external developed technologies that, if we access them, could improve agricultural technology. Arrange appropriate deals where hopefully everybody wins and the partner is happy as well as us and everybody gets what they need, and then manage them to develop products to benefit the growers. How did I get that job? Or I was asked to say something about our career path, which always makes me uncomfortable. How did I get to there from here, which is where I started as a graduate student? I know nothing about agriculture. Everything I've learned about agriculture, I learned while I worked at Monsanto. I was a yeast geneticist. I'm actually a geneticist, and I spent all my time studying the genetics of DNA replication and chromosome segregation, and I thought that's what I would spend my career doing as an academic. But the career goes this is depicted as a straight line just to depict time, but there's nothing straight about it. And also, some people have said in the last couple of days that failure is a great learning opportunity. And if that's true, I could well be one of those smartest people on earth. And I'll just mention a couple of those by way of illustrating unexpected things in careers. After I was a graduate student, I went to the University of Chicago for a postdoc, still doing work in yeast genetics, stayed on as an assistant professor, did not get tenure. If you are aiming at an academic career, the day you don't get tenure is a really frustrating day, right? Just blows everything apart. But I took that failure to look at what is it that drives me? What are my behavioral characteristics, and how did they contribute to not success in academia? And I realized that some of the very behaviors that led to failure in academia might well lead to success in an industrial environment. And so I made the transition to industry. I went to a company here in Cambridge called Transkaryotic Therapies, which was aimed at developing human gene therapies, was subsequently acquired by Shire Pharmaceuticals. I entered ag from that company at Sirion Genomics, which was Monsanto. Sirion was here in Cambridge. It was built as a wholly owned subsidiary of Monsanto aimed at bringing genomics technologies into Monsanto. This was the late 90s. Genomics was the next big thing. Monsanto had no genomics, and they established a collaboration with Millennium Pharmaceuticals, then the premier genomics-based therapeutics company, so we could learn genomics and bring it into ag. I did that, and I served as the lead of the genotyping discovery platform, trying to find DNA-based markers in the then unsequenced genomes of corn and soy. Think back, there was a time when we didn't know the sequence of everything. After a few years, that was closed, that site. I was offered a role at Monsanto in St. Louis, but for family reasons, this is a thing I think where it's critical that you all know what's important to you. My family was most important to me. I could not make it work to move to St. Louis and meet my family responsibilities, and so I chose not to relocate, and instead went off with a few other ex-Syrianites and did a startup company, venture-backed, doing metabolomic profiling in service of pharmaceutical development, trying to develop signatures for prediction of toxicities in new drugs. The technology worked great. The business plan somewhat less so, and that eventually folded. But I learned a lot out of that. I learned how to build something out of nothing. I learned how to work and how not to work with venture capital companies. That's a tricky business. It's trickier than you might think. And I learned a lot about people leadership and getting things done. Right after that folded, Monsanto called me and said, we want to build a protein engineering facility in Cambridge. Do you want to help with that? And I said, yeah, that sounds pretty cool, even though I know nothing about protein engineering. I think I could learn. And so I did that, and I built a site here in Cambridge, again as a collaboration with another external company. And we built a very high throughput protein engineering facility. I led that for a few years, and then I had an opportunity to lead the agronomic traits program. That's where all the transgenic, insect-resistant, and herbicide-tolerant crops are created. That was yet another new learning. I knew nothing about creating transgenics. I moved to lead our RNAi research program, and then I served as global chemistry lead, which is really kind of bizarre because I said I didn't know anything about protein engineering. I know nothing about chemistry. But the other important lesson, I think, is it's not so important what you know technically, as long as you can surround yourself with people who know more than you do. And that's a thing that it's a transition in a career it's sometimes hard to get comfortable with, that you have people reporting to you who know more than you do, right? And figure out how to get comfortable with that and enable them to do the great work that they can do using their knowledge. That's what leadership in science ultimately ends up at this kind of level. And lastly, I joined Bayer just a year ago with the acquisition of Monsanto. And so that's my strange career path. But I think the theme that I'd like to get out of this for folks young in careers, embrace a stance of continuous learning. Don't be afraid to make changes. Don't be afraid to take risks. Embrace risk. You get nothing without risk. And of course, as other people have said, learn from your failures. Every failure is a learning opportunity. Okay, and then before I get to the future, I'm going to tell one more thing about the past. So in 1982, I took a year off from graduate school, leave of absence, and I had a job as a research technician. And my job was to sequence one gene from one organism. And we used to do it on things that look sort of kind of like this, using something called Maxim-Gilbert sequencing back in the dark ages, radioisotope labeled DNA with chemical cleavage specific to the bases, separate it manually on a gel, and then take that X-ray film, read the bases, and write it on a piece of paper, and then type it into a computer. One gene, 1 year. Okay. When I was at Sirion, machine-based sequencing had been developed. It was still pretty primitive at that time, but it was still expensive. Each sample cost $3 to get about 200 bases of sequence. To get the marker project going, I had a sequencing budget of about $4 million just for sequencing, okay? Now you sequence whole genomes in an afternoon for $100. But it worked, and we were able to create the first SNP-based maps of corn and soy. SNPs are single nucleotide polymorphisms, and set up a high-throughput genotyping system, and that created, you know, a lot of people, breeders, weren't quite sure what they would do with molecular markers in corn and soy. Giving them the tool allowed them to find out what they can do, and launching that first system created more demand, which created more markers, which, you know, and so the whole process of genotyping accelerated to the point where we went to do fingerprints using chips. And ultimately, and this is the state we're at now, whole genome sequencing for genotyping in the breeding process. Let me tell you something about breeding. Here's the way it usually works. This is going to reduce this. A breeder would have a fit if you heard me say. Basically, you take two lines that you think are interesting and you cross them and you get progeny, and you plant out those progeny in a field. You observe their phenotypes and the yield they produce and so on. This takes a lot of land, right? And it takes a whole season to get the results. The technology has now advanced. We know so much about the genome. We can sequence so fast and so cheap. And we've developed machine learning to the point that we can predict outcomes of the plants without ever planting them. And so right now, this is 14 acres of field testing. This is a sequencing chip. It happens to be from an ion torrent machine. What we used to do, planting out 14 acres of testing, growing it all season, measuring the plants, we skipped that step entirely and just sequenced the genome, okay? We get the answer in 2 days. Why did I tell you this story? Because the next part's about the future. And I find the future difficult to predict. And although, you know, back when I was doing this kind of sequencing, I did imagine that there might ultimately be machines that do that, and I thought that would be great. I don't think very many people back in the 80s imagined that there would be machines, and also the increase in compute power and algorithmic predictive tools that would enable you to do what I just described. Maybe I'm short on vision and imagination. I never thought of a thing like that. So the future has the potential, given convergence of technological advances, to be really quite different than you might imagine, I think. It's not always a single technology, it's the convergence of technologies that matter. Even if you had machine sequencing, if you didn't have machine learning advances and compute power advances, that wouldn't have been possible. You need both, and some other stuff besides. Okay. So, things about the future of ag, then. I think that's what comes next. Talked about breeding technologies. It goes a little farther than that. Gene editing can be applied to great advantage in agricultural, and particularly by altering crops. We already know you can increase disease resistance through highly specific edits in the genome. We know you can make plants more drought tolerant. These are products that are being worked on now. We know that you can take even just standard transgenic approaches, you can make them more efficient and more precise by, instead of letting a transgene integrate wherever it happens to in the genome, you can put it exactly where you want it now using gene editing, and we do that. And those kind of things bring improved varieties and improved traits to market probably 3 to 4 years faster is the projection, what will happen than is currently the case. So the rate of genetic gain and the rate of inherent productivity increase it'll go faster. Right now, one of our bigger projects in corn is to fundamentally alter the architecture of the corn plant, similar to what Norman Borlaug did with wheat many, many years ago. Through gene editing, we know that we can make something like a semi-dwarf corn. That has all kinds of advantages. If you have severe weather in a cornfield, what happens to the corn? It lays down. Sometimes it gets back up, sometimes it doesn't. This happens every year to many growers, and they don't know, of course, whether it's going to happen or not. If you make short corn plants, they stand up. We test this by flying helicopters over the fields to create big blasts of wind and see whether the plants stand up or not. That kind of thing, there's other advantages as well. The plants have less biomass, vegetative biomass, which means more of the resources from the soil, and the inputs can go to the grain, okay? This will be a big transformation in corn farming. Similar kinds of edits will impact many other crops as well. Let's see. Some of the technologies you might not think of as biotech, really, but I think these are going to have major impacts on the future of farming. Digital innovation on the farm is happening now in a very big way. And it's estimated that this will dramatically increase the efficiency of farm operations and thereby the output that you can get out of a farm. Precision agriculture, when it first started, what it meant was the grower's tractor was guided by a GPS, and what that got you was really straight lines, and you didn't have to pay attention so much to where you were driving the tractor. That's true, but it's more than that. What precision agriculture allows you to do is things like match the planting density to the capability of the soil square meter by square meter over the field, right? It's a true thing that different parts of a field can support different levels of growth. If you overplant, you get less yield. You lose total productivity. And by studying a lot of the data and using machine learning, we can now provide growers with scripts that direct their planters to plant at a specific rate at specific parts of the field. Also, multi-variety planting. So not necessarily the case that all parts of a field will produce the most with the same hybrid or variety. Planters now have the capability to plant multiple hybrids and change on the fly what it's planting in this meter from that meter. And that's all directed by precision agriculture. Nitrogen, which I mentioned, right now mostly growers apply all the nitrogen they can afford and they apply it over their whole field. There are now really quite good models of how much nitrogen is needed in a field, given the weather, the rain, and other factors, and can help growers understand how much nitrogen they really need to put in what part of the field, which gets you farther away from the practice of putting more nitrogen than is needed, which increases environmental sustainability. Part of this increase in precision planting is driven by the accumulation of data from satellite imagery. So over the last decades, a lot of imagery has been collected of farmland. And in particular, hyperspectral imagery has been really important. And it's now possible, using the accumulated hyperspectral images, knowledge of yield outcomes, disease states, and weather patterns, to predict at the end of June or the beginning of July the yield from a corn or soybean field that will happen in October from the imagery on the plants. Why is that important? Because it gives the grower time to make an intervention of some sort to increase the yield or treat for a disease or irrigate or apply nitrogen, whatever might be necessary to maximize the output. Robotics. See, there's very little biology in a lot of this right now. The near-term future innovations are going to be a lot about digital machines and algorithmic predictions. Right now, we control weeds largely by spraying herbicides in a broadcast manner over the entire field, sometimes from airplanes, right? Just the whole field. That's not really efficient. It puts more chemistry out there than you might really need if you could do it a different way. A form of mechanical or automated weeding that's already been developed, but it's got a long ways to go to be used in large-scale agriculture, is something called see and spray, where a robot goes across the field, it images the ground and the plants as it goes. It can tell the difference between the crop and the weed and spray an herbicide only on each weed individually, not even getting the ground around it, just the weed. So that gives a very precise and targeted use of chemical crop protection reagents. Similar things are being developed for application of fungicides to plants, to only put them on the plants that need them and only in the right dose. I think the net result, you know, if you're the company that sells these things, which Bayer is, a little bit of a challenge there, because you're gonna enable growers to use less of your product. But we have a commitment to sustainability, and if that's what it's gonna take, that's what we have to do. Robots can also do monitoring and scouting, which means going out and surveying the field and asking, is there a leaf spot developing on this corn? Or do these tomatoes have an infestation of an insect that's gonna create a viral disease? This can all be automated increasingly, and it will be. And lastly, automated harvesting. You know, labor is a serious challenge in the ag industry now, and it's only gonna get worse. There's fewer and fewer people who are willing to go out in fields and manually cut the heads off broccoli and put them in a tub. There's now automated broccoli harvesters. That was only made possible, again, by another convergence of technology, which was breeding, where broccoli was bred to be taller and make room for the harvester to come and get it, okay? That breeding was enabled by genomic markers and sequencing, and then the development of the robots themselves. Drones. So drones can do more things than deliver packages from Amazon. So right now, not so much in the US. In the US, drones are primarily used right now for scouting, taking imagery and giving it back to the grower so he can monitor what's going on in his field. But pretty rapidly, drones will be able to apply crop protection reagents and fertilizer. And this is already happening primarily in Southeast Asia, where drones are very widely used in rice fields and in certain tree crops. If you want to see about this, go look up a company on Google called XAG. They have some really impressive video of what drones can be used for in agriculture. And this can be tied with artificial intelligence to automatically script the drone, where it goes, how it flies, how much it applies of what, when, to which plants. And again, getting precision control of the use of inputs. And then finally, novel farming systems. There's a variety of these. I think everyone is pretty familiar with aquaculture. Increasingly, world protein is probably going to come from fish and through fish farming. Different kind of farming than what my company is involved in, but it's an increasingly significant source of protein. Insect farming. So I think the largest likely use here is as animal feed. Insects are a great source of protein. Animals are happy to eat insects. Some people think people will be happy to eat insects. I'm a little less certain about that. But you can make a lot of protein relatively efficiently in large volumes with insect farming, and it's an emerging technology. And lastly, vertical farms. This is a particularly interesting one, primarily for vegetables, and right now it's largely applied to leafy green vegetables, but the technology is being developed to do much more with this. even root vegetables and so on. It might never develop to the point where you can do row crops, and probably you couldn't get enough enclosed space to produce the row crops, but vegetable production will increasingly be done by indoor farming. The advantages of this is that you have an extremely controlled environment, which is shielded from many of the pressures that are imposed on traditional outdoor agriculture of vegetables, right? Very few insects. You can control the entry of insects very easily, very controllable disease pressure, extremely consistent environment, water, light, temperature, and it's all controllable. And when you build it vertically, you can get an awful lot on a small land footprint, because land is also one of the inputs that's limiting, right? Here's the downside at present. It requires an enormous amount of energy to keep the heat the right temperature, to supply all that artificial lighting. But artificial lighting is becoming much more efficient. This would never have been possible in an economically feasible way without the advent of LED, right? That's what made the transition really possible. The fact that lighting has become so much more efficient, and it will continue to become even more efficient. Okay, I'm seeing Q&A time. Let me get to the next thing. Oh, crap. Well, I'm really behind. Soil is the new oil. Soil health. I thought I was done, but there's one more. This is a really important one. Soil health is really important in maintaining agricultural productivity. One of the major things that influence soil health is microbes. What kind of microbes are there? How healthy are they? What are the communities they live in? And also, there's a big potential with microbes here that's illustrated in the next slide. It comes back to the nitrogen challenge that I mentioned earlier. And I'm going to play a little video if I can figure out how. Okay.
So people don't realize, but microbes are essentially everywhere.
Saw him yesterday.
Right? So on your skin right now, on your face, part of the reason you have bad breath is because of microbes. You use deodorant because of microbes. And plants are just the same as people. So there's microbes that live on them, on their leaves, on their roots. They break down certain things for the plant. They provide certain nutrients or growth factors for the plant. Like in soybeans, for example, they even provide fertilizer to the plant. But a lot of your other crops, particularly our big food crops like corn, wheat, and rice, they don't have microbes that do this.
So most crops need artificial nitrogen fertilizer because there isn't enough nitrogen naturally existing in soils. Artificial fertilizers are incredibly important to feeding the global population. About 48% of the current population exists because of these artificial fertilizers. Nitrogen fertilizers are so interesting because they are not only this huge benefit to society, but they also come with these huge consequences to public health and the environment. When we apply fertilizers to crops, only about 50% of it makes it into the food that we eat, and the rest becomes an environmental pollutant.
What do we do about the problem with synthetic nitrogen fertilizers? If you banned it tomorrow, a large part of the world population would starve. So that's not a viable alternative. The purpose of Join Bio, the reason we're there, is to provide new, innovative, sustainable solutions to growers. Our specific approach is to use beneficial microbes and engineer them to address specific challenges or specific problems that the grower has.
If you go look at soybeans, and peanuts and other legumes, there's microbes on their roots that do what we want to do in corn already today. And that means that the genetic program, if you look inside that microbe, there's a piece of DNA that tells it how to do that.
At Ginkgo, we create custom organisms by using our foundry to go out and find new genes, synthesize them, put them into our organisms, test them, and then find the best ones to put into our final strain.
And that's at the crux of what we're trying to do, is not eliminate, not ban fertilizer, but rather can we use microbes to significantly reduce the amount that growers need to put out there.
In the 20th century, we learned how to feed the world. And in the 21st century, we need to learn how to not only feed the world, but do so in a way that is environmentally sustainable.
Okay, so that, I think, illustrated a couple of things besides just the nitrogen fixation. but also the need for collaboration and convergence of technologies, bringing together the prowess in engineering microbes and the knowledge of microbes that Ginkgo Bioworks has with the knowledge of plants that Bayer has, and trying to make something new out of the convergence. One more challenge I'm going to talk about briefly, and that's communication and understanding. 100% of the people in the world eat food. Less than 2% of the people in the world are involved in the production of food. Okay? People who eat food largely have no idea how agriculture gets done because they have no reason to. They go to the grocery store and the food is there, right? And so it's hard for most people to understand the challenges in agriculture, the challenges in the distribution system, the challenges that a grower faces and why he needs the technology to continue producing the food. And it often results in a misunderstanding of technology. When people understand the benefit of a technology, you end up with this. What is this? This is people lined up to get the next iPhone, which is a pretty impressive piece of technology that no one who uses it understands how it works, right? But they all adopt it despite they don't know what it is, they don't know if it gives you brain cancer, they adopt it because they understand the benefit it brings to them, right? The same cannot be said of innovation in agriculture. And I think instead you end up with this, where there's a really big disparity between what scientists, and I don't just mean scientists at Bayer, I mean scientists think about agricultural technologies, and what the public thinks. And there's only one way to change this, and that's to communicate your science to the public. And I think it's the responsibility of every scientist, whatever field you're in, to learn how to talk about your science and its benefits in a way that resonates emotionally with the people you're serving. The science does not speak for itself. As scientists, we often think the science speaks for itself, and it doesn't. It needs people to speak to why it's important for everybody. And I hope you figure out how to talk to folks as you develop your careers and do your science and innovation. And that's all I wanted to say, and I'm way over time.
My name is Francisco Flores. I'm from Ecuador, and I work in a company that does microbiomes for agriculture. So I really enjoy your talk. So my question is, given that the environment is really a big part of the phenotype of the plant, do you think that breeding for local varieties in different countries, such as mine, would make a big impact on the productivity of
So breeding crops for different environments in different regions is a thing that's routinely done. So almost all the breeding programs for almost all the crops have a geographic or regional target, right? The same cannot be said of transgenics, where the cost and time involved in creating a transgenic is so large that it has to pretty much be something that you can imagine using everywhere.
Hi, hello. Thank you for that talk. I'm Anastasia from Greece, electrical engineering, computer science student. I wanted to ask more about how you approach and collaborate with the various farms around the world. You said you serve every farm, no matter the size. Is it the farms that reach out with their problems and you try to create innovative solutions for them? Or is it that you create your solutions and then try to find farms that fit your criteria to apply those and test them?
Yeah, so in R&D, our primary collaboration is with technology innovators, which are rarely farms, okay? So it might be like Ginkgo or sequencing companies or someone who's developing some other novel platform. With respect to reaching out to farms, what we do is it's relatively late in the process where we trial new products or new protocols for growth with growers using a program we call Groundbreakers. And what we do is we enlist some set of farmers who are known as early adopters, people who want to try new technologies. And we supply them with the technology at essentially no cost. whether it's a smallholder in Africa or a 10,000-acre farmer in Iowa. And the only thing we ask is that we get the data from their farm and see how the products work. And this has been very successful. And growers, a certain kind of grower is really eager to participate in this kind of research, late-stage research to see how the technology works. And the data that we get back from that is phenomenally valuable.
Hi, thank you very much for the exciting talk. My name is Albert. I'm a biotech student from the Copenhagen University. So I was just wondering, you were talking a lot about, for instance, the robots with the precision pesticide chemical. And I'm wondering, I know at my institute, Plant and Environmental Sciences, we are looking a lot at biopesticides and using a lot of funding and research in that respect. And I was wondering, is that also something you do at
Yes.
Bayer, and what's your opinion on it?
So we are internally at Bayer working on developing microbes as biopesticides. When the pesticide, not weeds, I think the likelihood of success of microbial control of weeds is very low, but insects and disease, yes. This is an active research program. It's also an active research program at every ag company and in about 150 small companies that I know about. The chief problem right now is that the efficacy of the microbes you can find in nature is nowhere near as high as what you can achieve with chemistry. And until that changes, and it might change through engineering of the microbes, they will remain a sort of a niche product used by organic growers, specialty growers of certain kinds, because large-scale growers can't produce with that level of pest control efficacy. They need something much stronger. But microbes are a great source of potential for this kind of thing.
Hi, I'm Daniela, process engineer. I wanted to ask you, so it is evident that if you're going to go for optimization, of course, the consumption of pesticides and so on will decrease. Then how are you ensuring this is going to be sustainable, not only for the environment and the farmers, but also for the company?
How will the company be sustainable if we contribute strongly to environmental sustainability?
No, I mean from the, shareholders' perspective. Yeah. I think that's also nice for us to keep in mind so that we acknowledge that it is possible to be sustainable, but also profitable.
Right. I think, in fact, that this is ultimately going to take a new business model of how growers recognize the value that they get from the inputs that they use and how they pay for them. And it might need to take a shift to something like the growers pay the suppliers based on outcome, right? That what they're paying for is not a gallon of chemistry, but a 10% bump in yield. Right? And if we can work out that kind of a business model, some of the problems associated with this kind of change for a company that provides solutions become much less severe. But it's a really bold change in a business model.
So I actually have one question. So one theme that emerged very early on in the conference is how computation and robotics are really transforming the job landscape and optimizing human performance. In the ag space and sustainability broadly, what types of new jobs do you foresee really coming as a result of this increased performance?
That's a good question, and I don't know that I have a good answer, but it's a very new thing that data scientists and AI specialists have a utility in agriculture, right? So it's a job that existed before, but there was no utility until recently in agriculture. And I think increasingly, it might just change the nature of, let's say, agronomic advisors. So right now, grower has agronomic advisors. They have very traditional educations in weeds and pests and soil and so on. Increasingly, they're going to have to add familiarity and fluency with predictive tools and models, because that's what's going to get adopted by the growers. It's already successful. It's going to come. And I don't think anymore it's going to be enough to have the guy at the co-op who helps you pick the right bag of seed. It's going to need to be backed up by data and prediction. And so that's going to be a new specialty in the ag field, maybe. I don't
Thank
know.
you.
I didn't predict machine sequencing either. So.
Well, thank you. That's all the questions we have time for.